Good morning, Alex here. And if you are here, it's likely because you're trying to optimize your development environment. And today you're in luck. I have some cool advanced repo tricks for us to look at. And when I say advanced, my goal with this video is actually to show you things that you've probably never done before. So this is not your typical, here's how I set up my repo kind of video. I actually want to dive a little bit deeper into some other things you can do outside of your application code that help you have a better development environment. With that being said, let's jump right in and have a look at trick number 1. And the first one sets the tone a little bit for the kind of tricks that we're going to be looking at in this video, and it's actually to do your own code gen. Frameworks do it, whether you're using TanStack Start or you're using Next. You have some libraries such as Convex that also does some code gen. I know the old Prisma used to do some code gen. And ultimately, this is a different way to solve some of the problems. I'm going to show you a quick example how I use code gen in my workflow to enable additional things on the type safety side. So in VS Code here, I like to put some of these types of things under a plugins folder. And you'll see for Next, I actually have a nice little codegen example, which is public images. And the code itself is just in TypeScript, and it can use Node to do file system type of things. Here, what I'm using this to do is actually to add some type safety on the default Next image component to basically have IntelliSense and autocomplete for all the images in the public folder. So what I mean by that is if I go to, say, a page here, and we look at the image component, when you're writing the source, I now have autocomplete that shows me next.svg is an option that exists. When you're jumping from one framework to the other, sometimes it's tough to remember, do I have to write assets here, or do I have to write public here before? In the case of Next, it's actually quite simple. You don't need to do any of that, but having the nice autocomplete just makes that even more straightforward, no typos, and now much more type safe sources for your images. So how am I able to inject some types into kind of a built-in Next component? Well, I'm replicating what Next does internally for things like typed routes, which is basically to scan through all of the images that are in the public folder and create a file just by writing it out that will go and be linked with your application code. And we can interpolate in the string different things that we want. In this case, all the images will be in the public image path. And then we're doing that in the Next image module to overwrite the built-in types. And you could now, with Node, just strip the types and run the script to generate this file somewhere and have it be in your repository. But I wanted it to update whenever I add new images. So if I put Next1 here, I would like that to be included in my type. So what I ended up doing, and this is another little trick of itself, is in your Next config, because this file is evaluated at runtime, I can just import this script, which has the side effect of running and creating the type file. So that means I don't have to manually call the script. Whenever I go and I write pm dev, it actually will run the script at that time. You can see here public images generated types for 2 images. And now when I go to my page and I try to autocomplete, you'll see I have both of the options now showing. I've just decided to put that file in the .next types, and you can see the generated file here. Make sure it's imported in your TS config if you want to do something similar. This is just one very simple example of what you can do with CodeGen, but this can also be used for creating client-side SDKs for all of your API routes. It can be used for templates and templating code that you're rewriting all the time. So it's a really powerful tool that you should definitely have in your toolbox when you're working in any code repository. Now let's move on to trick number 2. And now we're going even deeper. So what we're going to be looking at now is how can we actually tap into the TypeScript compiler by writing our own plugins? So this can solve very similar problems, but the advantage of going with TypeScript plugins is that you can catch errors and enforce your own rules with the errors being in, say, squiggly lines underneath the code that's wrong. So how do you build your own TypeScript plugin? Well, in your TS config, you can see Next has a plugin. So again, frameworks do this. But I've created my own, which is this TypeScript Next Save Page plugin. And again, I put that in my repository under plugins, TypeScript, and I have my next save page. When you're creating a plugin, just make sure it has a package JSON and a name, and that you add it to your dev dependencies so that your package manager can create the symlink to it. But ultimately, all that this is again, a file that uses the TypeScript TS server library to expose additional, say, diagnostics, those red squiggly lines that may appear in your code if you're not following conventions properly. You just have to export default a basically plugin module. The example I have here, Next Save Page, this is something you'll find in my TanStack versus Next for type safety video, where I developed a little wrapper around the next page to have additional type safety around search parameters, path parameters, so that it matches a little bit how TanStack Router does all of these things. So super great video. You should definitely go check that out. And in this case, I added a plugin so that if my page here is not specifying a path that matches with the path of the file where it's declared, then I will get a TypeScript compiler error. So if you watched a previous video, you'll know that this is type safe and gives me all the different paths that exist in my application. But if I change root here for another path, it actually is valid according to the type system, but I still have my plugin catch an additional error, which is the path videos doesn't match the expected path route for this file location. And you can see the error code is page routes and then the custom number that I gave it. So you can create your own diagnostic errors that you'll get prior to runtime. So this is great to catch your own errors, and for any file conventions you have, using TypeScript compiler plugins allows you to reference which file you're in when you're building out all of these rules. But really, there's a lot of different things you can do with this, and I highly recommend you consider it when you have another future problem to solve that this might be the more elegant solution for. All right, let's go for trick number 3. And this one is custom lint rules. So again, we're trying to catch some errors before runtime by having additional things enforced in your code style. And unlike a TypeScript compiler plugin, this is more so about the style and the rules that you want to enforce. Every one of you hopefully has a linter that you have in your project, whether that's ESLint, or more recently, I've actually been experimenting with Oxlint and Biome. I've kind of settled on Biome at this point, just because it also does the formatting and I don't really like Prettier. So make sure you pay attention to the configuration of your linter in your repository, because not only can you have some default configuration that catches a lot of rules, but you can also enforce your own conventions in those rules. A good example is I don't like default exports in any of my code files, but Next does require it for all the page, the layouts, and all the different files that Next will look for. And so my base rule has no default export rule being on, but I've customized it and overrode it so that in all of the Next files, this is turned off. This is a very simple override, but whenever I'm enforcing rules, I'm thinking about, is there maybe different paths that the rule should not apply, or maybe different paths that the rules should be different, and I make sure to update my lint config to match all of those things that I would like. And little extra tip here, if you are using Biome, which is the linter I do recommend now, I would highly recommend looking into Ultrasite. It's basically a Biome config that applies a lot of best practices and configures all the rules for you. So if you don't want to spend too much time going through all the rules and turning them on or turning them off, this is a great starting point. Now, I didn't quite find the value in having Ultrasite directly installed in my repository, but I did go in their GitHub and pulled all of the different rules that they have that are relevant to me. So the Next rules, the React rules, and obviously their core rule set, which applies to many programming languages. And then I just brought those in my repo and put them under config Biome. And now I don't need to rely on a third-party install and my rules being in a package. I actually have them in my repository, and I've made a few updates to them. If you're curious about my rule set that I use for Biome, be sure to check out the links in the description. Everything I'm showing today, I have set up in my personal site and repository that you can find on GitHub. All right, let's move on to trick number 4. And now we're back in a little bit more advanced type of trick, which is creating your bundler plugins, whether that's for TurboPack or Webpack or other bundlers that you may be using for your project. And this is really a key to transforming your code before it's running at runtime. And again, this is something that frameworks and libraries do all the time. It's common now in React to have directives such as use client, use server, which transforms the code you write before it actually ends up running. This is also how use workflow from the Vercel workflow dev kit is implemented, and it has directives that transform your code in order to set up some infrastructure for you. So the tip here is don't be afraid to look into how to create your own bundler plugin that manipulate your code after you've written it, because it can really improve your developer experience if you set up the right abstractions and primitives that allow developers to have a higher velocity. And ultimately, you're just writing simple plugin code instead of application code. So it's definitely approachable for everyone watching this video. My buddy Felix was recently working in an Electron project, and he was inspired by all the directives popping up, and he decided to build his own directive, use Electron. Because if you're familiar with Electron, it's a little bit complicated to send messages from the server side of Electron versus the client side of Electron. And he just built a simple bundler plugin that leverages a use Electron directive to manipulate the code after it's written in order to enable a great developer experience that is kind of like the React use server, where you can just write your code and it will run in that different environment once everything is bundled together. Definitely something to look into if you want to push the limits of what's possible by writing simple code that translates into complex infrastructure or multi-environment setups. And the last tip I have today is IDE native automation. And this is about using tools and functionality that's in your IDE to do repo specific tasks. So you definitely want to be familiar with how to use your IDE, whether that's a VS Code, Fork, or Zed, or you're in NeoVim. If you're in NeoVim, I don't have to tell you that you can customize your IDE for your dev workflow. But if you're using something like VS Code, there's a lot of built-in things that you can do, like running tasks. And by default, you'll have tasks that are in your package manager. But you can also create custom tasks. With AI nowadays, be sure to configure custom prompts that do things that you repetitively ask it to do. One that's actually built in that I use all the time is if I go here and let's say this didn't have documentation, I can just pull my AI and say /doc, and then it will go and it will create the JS doc for me. And any kind of functions that I export from an internal lib will now be nice and documented and have all the examples, what it returns, etc. You can create your own custom prompts that do things that are repetitive, or you can create tasks that run in your IDE in the background, perhaps watching your files, rerunning some of the scripts like we talked at the beginning to optimize your developer experience. Now on to the bonus tip that I have for you today. Something I did a whole video on prior, which is local SSL. I highly recommend running your local environment in a way that matches production as much as possible, and having HTTPS locally is amazing for that. If you take the little bit of time it takes to set it up at the start, you don't have to have exception everywhere in the application code to check whether you're on localhost or you're not on localhost to handle things differently. You can also test third-party libraries that require SSL. You can have OAuth work on your local environment. This is really key, and definitely check the video in the description if you're not running your applications with HTTPS locally. I also tried to have my database setup mimic production. So I don't really like running a Docker locally versus when it's live, it's a connection URL. So I'm a big fan of the services that allow database branching, such as PlanetScale or Neon. Not a big fan of Neon, but PlanetScale. And you can even have local development branches off of that database so that when you're developing locally, you're actually connecting still to a database in the cloud which is great. Those are the 5 tips that I had for you today. Hopefully, 1 or 2 of those are things that you've never done before, and now you're going to be more willing to explore. Whenever I'm solving a problem nowadays, I have these extra tools in my toolbox that I can use to solve that problem in a different way. If these tips were helpful for you, well, share this video with your colleague, your boss, or your friend, and make sure they're aware that now you're going to start solving problems perhaps a little bit differently in your project. And you can point them here if you want to give them ideas on how they can solve those types of problems too. Thank you so much for watching. And if you like these types of tricks, you'll love my other videos. Be sure to like and subscribe, and I'll see you again soon.